They had been warned since childhood that America was a land of monsters, that women prisoners would be beaten, starved, humiliated. So when the German POW women were marched into the mess hall that first morning in America, none of them dared to sit. But then the smell hit them. Fresh bread, eggs, coffee, butter. One woman began to cry. Another whispered, "This must be a trick, because if this breakfast was real, then everything Joseph Goebbels had ever told them was a lie." Greta Hoffmann was 7 years old when she first saw the poster. It hung in her classroom in Munich, beside the portrait of the Führer, a grotesque caricature of an American soldier, fangs bared, claws extended, looming over a cowering woman. The caption read, "This is what awaits German women in enemy hands." Her teacher, Frau Schneider, pointed at it with a wooden ruler. "Remember this," she said. "The Americans are not like us. They do not honor women. They do not respect purity. They are animals dressed as men." Greta believed her. Why wouldn't she? Frau Schneider had kind eyes and brought apples for the children on Fridays. At night, the radio played. Her father would turn up the volume when the voice came on, that voice, smooth and certain, belonging to Reich Minister Joseph Goebbels. "The American nation," the voice said, "is a mongrel society, without culture, without morals. Their soldiers are criminals released from prisons to fight. German women who fall into their hands will suffer fates worse than death." Greta's mother would pull her close. "Never forget what he says. It could save your life." The message was everywhere. In newspapers, in films shown at school, in the hushed conversations between adults who thought children weren't listening. By the time Greta turned 14, she had heard the warnings 1,000 times. By 16, when she volunteered as a nurse's aide at a military hospital, the belief had fossilized into certainty. Better to die than be captured by Americans. She wasn't alone. Every girl she knew carried the same fear. Marlene Fisher, who worked in communications. Anna Weber, who managed supply routes. Ingrid Braun, who typed reports for Wehrmacht officers. They had all grown up with the same posters, the same radio broadcasts, the same terrible certainty about what awaited German women in enemy territory. In late 1944, as the war turned, the warnings intensified. "American soldiers are advancing," Goebbels announced. "They show no mercy. German women must evacuate or prepare to defend their honor with their lives." The women heard stories. A village where women chose drowning over capture. A town where mothers fed their daughters poison before the Americans arrived. These stories spread through whispers, through letters, through the desperate telephone calls that still occasionally connected distant relatives. The fear became a living thing. It breathed in their chests. It whispered in their ears at night. When Greta was reassigned to a field hospital near the Western Front in early 1945, her mother wept for 3 days. "Promise me," her mother said, gripping her hands. "Promise me if they come, you will find a way." Greta knew what she meant. Find a way to die quickly. Find a way to escape the fate Goebbels had described in such horrifying detail. "I promise," Greta said. She meant it. The other women at the field hospital shared the same grim determination. They were all young, between 17 and 25. They had all been raised on the same lies. One evening, as they prepared bandages in the dim light of kerosene lamps, Marlene said what they were all thinking. "If the Americans come, we should have a plan." "Pills," Anna suggested. "The doctors have morphine." "Or the river," Ingrid added quietly. "It's close." They weren't being dramatic. They genuinely believed these were their only options, because everything they had ever been taught told them that capture meant something worse than death. Torture, humiliation, violation, a loss of humanity so complete that no recovery was possible. Greta fingered the small vial she kept in her pocket, a gift from a sympathetic doctor, enough to stop a heart in minutes, just in case. The Americans came on a Tuesday. The artillery fire had stopped 3 hours earlier. That was the first strange thing. Greta and the others had been hiding in the hospital basement, pressed against cold stone walls, listening to shells impact the ground above. Then silence. Not the silence of safety. The silence of waiting. "They're here," Marlene whispered. Heavy boots on the floor above. Voices speaking English. The sharp commands of soldiers clearing rooms. Greta's hand moved to the vial in her pocket. This was the moment. This was when everything she'd been warned about would come true. The basement door opened. Light poured down the stairs, blinding them after hours in darkness. "Come out," a voice called in broken German. "Hands where we can see them." The women looked at each other. Anna was crying silently. Ingrid's lips moved in prayer. They climbed the stairs slowly, hands raised, blinking in the sudden brightness. American soldiers surrounded them. Young men, most of them looking as exhausted as the German women felt. They held rifles, but the rifles weren't pointed. One soldier, older than the others, stepped forward. He had sergeant's stripes on his sleeve. "Anyone injured?" he asked in careful German. No one answered. They were too shocked. He tried again. "Do any of you need medical attention?" Greta found her voice. "No." The sergeant nodded. "You are prisoners of war. You will not be harmed. Do you understand?" Greta stared at him. His face showed no cruelty, no savage anticipation, just professional efficiency and bone-deep weariness. "Do you understand?" he repeated. "Yes," she whispered. The women were searched quick, impersonal pat-downs conducted by a female military nurse who had arrived with the unit. Nothing like what they had feared. Then they were told to gather their belongings. "We're taking you to a processing center," the sergeant explained. "It's about 40 miles west. You'll be safe." Safe. The word felt like a trap. They were loaded into covered trucks. The soldiers offered them water and blankets. One young private, barely old enough to shave, helped Anna climb into the truck bed and murmured, "Sorry about all this." He apologized. Greta felt dizzy. Nothing was making sense. The trucks drove west through destroyed countryside. The women sat in silence, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the moment when the masks came off and the Americans showed their true nature. But the moment never came. At the processing center, a commandeered school building, they were registered, photographed, and given numbers. The process was impersonal but not cruel. No one shouted. No one touched them unnecessarily. A female officer explained in fluent German what would happen next. "You will be transported to the United States, to a prisoner of war facility. You will be housed separately from male prisoners. You will receive adequate food, medical care, and quarters. The Geneva Convention will be observed." "The Geneva Convention?" Marlene asked quietly. "You follow that?" The officer looked surprised. "Of course. Don't you?" The question hung in the air. That night, locked in a classroom with the other women, Greta couldn't sleep. "They haven't heard us," Anna said into the darkness. "Why haven't they heard us?" "It's too soon," Ingrid replied. "They're waiting. Once we're on American soil, where no one can witness it." "Maybe," Marlene interrupted. "Or maybe we were lied to." The suggestion was too enormous to process. Greta closed her eyes and felt for the vial in her pocket. Still there. Still an option, just in case. The ship was called the USS General Richardson. It had carried American soldiers to Europe. Now it carried German prisoners back across the Atlantic. The women were quartered in a section of the lower decks, separated from male POWs by locked bulkheads and armed guards. The quarters were cramped but clean metal bunks, thin mattresses, shared washrooms. Not the horror they had expected. Not yet. The crossing took 12 days. For Greta, those 12 days felt longer than the entire war. Every hour was spent waiting for the illusion to crack, for the false courtesy to end, for the Americans to reveal themselves as the monsters Goebbels had promised. But the illusion held. The women received 2 meals a day, not generous, but more than they had eaten in months. Watery soup, hard bread, occasionally canned vegetables. One morning, a sailor distributed apples, real apples, crisp and sweet. Greta bit into hers and almost wept. She hadn't tasted fruit in 2 years. "Why are they feeding us?" Anna asked that night. If they plan to kill us anyway, to fatten us up first, Ingrid said bitterly, to make the suffering worse. But even Ingrid didn't sound convinced. The women spent their days in a strange limbo. Some talked, some prayed, some stared at the walls, lost in private thoughts. Marlene had managed to keep a newspaper, the last edition of Der Stürmer she had grabbed before capture. She read and reread Goebbels' final columns, trying to reconcile his words with their current reality. America is a nation without honor, one passage read. They will parade our women through streets like trophies. They will degrade them in ways too obscene to print. But the American sailors barely looked at them. The guards maintained professional distance. The female nurses who checked on them daily treated them with neutral efficiency. On the 7th day, Greta worked up the courage to speak to one of the nurses, a woman named Lieutenant Patricia Morrison. When we arrive, Greta asked in halting English, "What happens to us?" Morrison looked at her with something like sympathy. "You'll be taken to a POW camp, probably in Texas or Louisiana. You'll work light-duty laundry, gardening, that kind of thing. You'll have access to mail, medical care, religious services. The war won't last much longer. When it's over, you'll go home. That's all?" Greta couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. Morrison frowned. "What did you think would happen?" Greta couldn't answer. How could she explain years of propaganda, of fear so deeply embedded it had become instinct? "We were told," she said finally, "that American soldiers would hurt us." Morrison's expression shifted shock, then anger, then sadness. "No," she said firmly. "That's not who we are." After Morrison left, Greta lay in her bunk and stared at the curved metal ceiling. Could an entire nation be lied to? Could millions of people believe something so completely untrue? The questions felt dangerous, like touching a wound. On the 11th day, land appeared on the horizon. America. The women gathered at the portholes to stare at the distant coastline. Some prayed. Others wept quietly. Greta felt nothing. She was too exhausted for fear, too confused for hope. That night, she took out the vial she'd carried since Germany. She held it up to the dim light, watching the liquid inside catch the glow. Then, slowly, she uncapped it and poured the contents into the wash basin. She didn't know why. She couldn't explain the decision, even to herself. But something in her had shifted during those 12 days at sea. Some small crack in the certainty she'd carried her entire life. Maybe the Americans were exactly as terrible as Goebbels had said, and she was making a fatal mistake. Or maybe she had been lied to. She would find out in the morning. The POW facility was located outside Fort Worth, Texas. The women arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late spring. The heat was shocking after the cold Atlantic crossing thick, heavy air that pressed against skin like a warm hand. They were unloaded from buses and marched through gates topped with barbed wire. Guard towers stood at each corner. Armed soldiers watched their arrival. This looked more like what they had expected. Security. Confinement. Control. But then the details emerged. The barracks were wooden structures with real beds, not bunks. Each woman received 2 blankets, a pillow, toiletries, and a change of clothes, sturdy work dresses in plain gray fabric. The compound included a mess hall, a medical clinic, a small library, and a recreation area with benches under shade trees. No electric fences, no attack dogs, no obvious instruments of torture. The camp commandant, a colonel named Robert Hendricks, addressed them through an interpreter. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the United States Army," he said. "You will be treated in accordance with international law. You will work 5 days a week at light labor. You will receive regular meals, medical care, and recreation time. Male privileges will be granted once processing is complete. Religious services are available on Sundays. Escape attempts will be punished. Otherwise, follow the rules and you will be fine." His tone was neither kind nor cruel. Administrative. Businesslike. The women were assigned to barracks in groups of 8. Greta found herself sharing space with Marlene, Anna, Ingrid, and 4 others she didn't know well. That first afternoon, They sat on their beds and looked around in stunned silence. "This is the prison?" Anna finally said. "This? It must be temporary," Ingrid insisted. "They'll move us somewhere worse once we're processed." But Marlene was looking at the small bookshelf near the door. She walked over and pulled out a volume, a German translation of Mark Twain. "They have books," she said quietly. In German. The women explored their new quarters cautiously, as if the walls might suddenly sprout weapons. They found hooks for clothing, a small mirror, clean windows that actually opened to let in the breeze. One of the other women, a quiet girl named Katrin Mueller, discovered the washroom at the end of the barracks. "Hot water," she called out. "They have hot water." The women crowded into the washroom to see for themselves. Katrin turned the tap, and steam rose from the basin. Real hot water. For washing. For prisoners. "I don't understand," Anna said. "I don't understand any of this." That evening, a guard came to escort them to the mess hall for dinner. He was young, maybe 22, with red hair and freckles across his sunburned nose. "This way, please," he said in careful German. Then, in English to himself. Poor kids looked terrified. The mess hall was a long building with rows of tables. The male POW compound was separate. They couldn't see it from here, so the space held only women prisoners. About 60 in total, from what Greta could count. They lined up for food, each receiving a tray and utensils. The serving women behind the counter were American civilians, local volunteers, Greta guessed. They spooned portions onto each tray without comment. The meal was simple: boiled potatoes, green beans, a piece of chicken, bread, and watery coffee. Greta stared at her tray. This was more food than she'd seen on a single plate in months. Maybe years. "Is this real?" Marlene whispered. "It must be a special meal," Ingrid said. "For our first day. Tomorrow it will be different." They found seats at an empty table. Around them, other prisoners ate quietly. Some watched the newcomers with curiosity. Most kept to themselves. Greta picked up her fork. Her hand shook slightly. She took a bite of potato. It was bland, overcooked, unseasoned. It tasted like a miracle. Anna ate 3 bites, then pushed her tray away and put her head in her hands. "I can't," she said. "I can't do this. It feels wrong." "What feels wrong?" Marlene asked. "Being treated like this, being fed like this. After everything we did, everything Germany did." Greta understood. There was a cognitive dissonance so profound it felt physical. Like her brain was splitting in two. On one side, years of propaganda, of warnings, of certainty about American cruelty. On the other, hot water, books, chicken on a plate. The two realities couldn't coexist. One of them had to be false. And if one was false, if the Americans weren't monsters, then what did that say about everything else they'd been taught? What did it say about Goebbels? About the Führer? About the war itself? Greta forced herself to eat. The food sat heavy in her stomach, but she finished every bite. Tomorrow morning, she thought, would tell them more. The first full day in the camp, the first real test of American promises. Tomorrow morning, they would learn the truth. Reveille sounded at 6. The women dressed in their gray work dresses and assembled outside the barracks. A cool morning breeze carried the smell of grass and distant livestock. The guard, the young red-headed one from yesterday, counted them off and then gestured toward the mess hall. "Breakfast," he said. Then work assignments. They walked in formation, although no one had told them to. Old habits from military training. The mess hall doors stood open. Early morning light streamed through the windows, and then they smelled it. Fresh bread, eggs, coffee, butter. Something sweet was that cinnamon. The smell hit Greta like a physical force. Her knees went weak. Beside her, Anna made a small choking sound. They filed into the mess hall and lined up for their trays. The women behind the serving counter smiled actual smiles and began filling plates. Scrambled eggs, golden and steaming. 2 slices of white bread with real butter. A small cup of orange juice. Coffee with milk and sugar available on the side. And a cinnamon roll, still warm from the oven. Greta stared at the tray in her hands. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be for them. They were prisoners. They were German. They were the enemy. And they were being given cinnamon rolls. "Please, sit," one of the serving women said in broken German. "Eat. It's getting cold." But no one sat. 60 women stood in the mess hall, holding trays of food, frozen in disbelief. The American guards watched with confused expressions. One of them said something to another in English, too quick for Greta to catch. Then, a female officer entered the mess hall. It was Lieutenant Morrison, the nurse from the ship. She must have been assigned to the camp medical staff. She looked at the standing women and seemed to understand immediately. "It's all right," she said gently in German. "The food is for you. All of you. Every morning. Please, sit and eat." Still, no one moved. Morrison walked over to Greta's group and pulled out a chair at the nearest table. "Here," she said. "I'll sit with you. See? It's safe." Slowly, carefully, Greta lowered herself into a chair. The others followed. She set her tray on the table. The eggs were still steaming. The butter on the bread was melting into golden pools. She picked up her fork. Her hand was shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Marlene, sitting across from her, had tears running down her face. She wasn't sobbing, just silent tears, as if her body didn't know what else to do with the emotion. Anna had her hands over her mouth, staring at her plate like it might disappear. Ingrid sat rigid, fork in hand, unable to move. Greta forced herself to take a bite of eggs. The taste exploded in her mouth. Real eggs, real butter, salt, pepper, made with care by someone who knew how to cook. She chewed slowly, swallowed, took another bite, and then she couldn't stop. She was eating like a starving animal, shoveling food into her mouth, barely tasting it anymore, just needing it inside her. Around her, the others did the same. 60 women eating in frantic silence, as if afraid someone would realize the mistake and take the food away. Katrine was crying openly now, tears falling into her eggs. Anna had finished everything on her plate and was staring at the empty tray in shock. Marlene held the cinnamon roll in both hands, looking at it like it was a sacred object. Lieutenant Morrison watched them with an expression Greta couldn't quite read. Sadness, maybe, or pity. After a few minutes, Morrison spoke. "You thought we would starve you," she said quietly. "Didn't you?" No one answered. "You thought we would beat you, torture you, treat you like animals." Still silence. Morrison's jaw tightened. "What did they tell you?" "Your government. What did they say about us?" Greta found her voice. "They said you were monsters. And now?" Greta looked down at her empty plate. At the smear of butter and egg yolk. At the crumbs of cinnamon roll. "I don't know what to think," she whispered. Morrison nodded slowly. "Good. Thinking for yourself is a start." She stood and addressed the room in German. "You will eat like this every morning. This is not special treatment. This is standard rations for prisoners in our care. You will also receive lunch and dinner. You will not go hungry. You will not be abused. You are protected by American military law and the Geneva Convention. We are not monsters. We are soldiers doing our duty." She paused. "And for what it's worth, I'm sorry someone convinced you otherwise." Then she left. The women sat in silence, processing what had just happened. Greta looked around the mess hall. At the other women, all wearing the same expression of stunned confusion. At the empty plates. At the guards standing casually by the doors, not even holding their rifles at ready. At the serving women, who were already bringing out seconds for anyone who wanted more. Seconds. They were offering seconds. "They fed us," Anna said numbly. "They actually fed us. Not just fed," Marlene corrected. "They fed us well." Ingrid was staring at her hands. "Everything we were told. Everything Goebbels said. Every warning. Every broadcast." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. They all understood. If the Americans weren't monsters, if this breakfast was real, if this treatment was genuine, then the implications were staggering, because it meant they had fought on the wrong side. It meant they had believed lies. It meant their entire understanding of the world, of the war, of morality itself, had been built on propaganda. The truth couldn't be swallowed as easily as scrambled eggs. But it was there, unavoidable, sitting heavy in their stomachs along with the food. Joseph Goebbels had lied. About everything. The work assignments were posted after breakfast. Greta was assigned to the laundry, Marlene to gardening, Anna to the kitchen, Ingrid to the library, organizing books. They worked 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. The labor was light, easier than what they'd done during the war. No one shouted. No one threatened. When someone needed a break, they could take one. At lunch, they received sandwiches and fruit. At dinner, a hot meal, sometimes meat. Always vegetables. Always bread. Every single day. By the end of the first week, Greta had gained 3 pounds. She could see it in her reflection, her face filling out, the sharp edges of malnutrition softening. The other women looked healthier too, color returning to their cheeks, strength returning to their movements. One evening, sitting outside the barracks in the fading light, Marlene did the math. "We're eating better here than we did in Germany," she said. "Even before the war. My family never had cinnamon rolls for breakfast. My mother worked in a factory," Katrine added. "She would have killed for a meal like we had today. Chicken and carrots and fresh bread. And, we were told," Anna said bitterly, "that America was a poor country, that they had no food, that their people were starving while we prospered." Greta closed her eyes and tried to remember the propaganda films, the ones shown in school, at rallies, in theaters before the feature presentations, images of American breadlines, desperate people, crime-ridden cities. "We live in paradise," the narrator would say over footage of Germany, "while the decadent democracies crumble." But now she was in America, a prisoner, and she was eating better than she had as a free woman in paradise. The cognitive dissonance was physical, like trying to hold 2 opposing truths in her mind at once, and feeling her thoughts buckle under the weight. Ingrid, who had been silent for days, finally spoke. "In the library," she said, "there are newspapers, American newspapers, from before the war, during the war, now." "So?" Marlene asked. "I've been reading them. My English is good enough." She paused. "There are no breadlines. No mass starvation. They have rationing, like we did. But people aren't dying in the streets. They have cars, factories, schools, normal lives," Goebbels said. "I know what Goebbels said," Ingrid's voice cracked. "I listened to every broadcast. I believed every word. And it was all lies, Marlene. All of it." The words hung in the air. "We don't know that," Anna said weakly. "Maybe this is just one camp. Maybe they're treating us well because why?" Ingrid demanded. "Because they want something from us? What could we possibly have that they want? We're prisoners. We're nobody. If they wanted to torture us, why waste food? Why give us books and hot water and medicine?" No one had an answer. Greta thought about the radio broadcasts. Goebbels' voice, so certain and smooth. "American soldiers eat with knives drawn," he had said in one memorable speech. "They are barbarians who know nothing of civilized behavior. They will treat our women like livestock." But this morning, a young private had helped Greta carry a basket of wet laundry. He'd said, "These look heavy. Ma'am, let me help." "Ma'am." He called her ma'am. That night, Greta lay in bed and tried to reconcile her memories with her current reality. She remembered her mother's fear. Real fear, sincere and desperate. Her mother had genuinely believed that American capture meant death, or worse. She remembered her own terror on the ship, the vial of poison, the certainty that stepping onto American soil meant stepping into hell. And she remembered this morning's breakfast. Eggs and bread and coffee and care. Someone had lied. Either Goebbels had lied about America, or the Americans were running an elaborate deception that served no clear purpose. Occam's razor suggested the simpler answer. Goebbels had lied. About America. About the war. About everything. The realization should have brought relief. But instead, it brought something worse. Shame. Because if they had been lied to about America, then they had been lied to about everything. About Poland, about France, about Russia, about the camps they'd heard whispered about but never discussed, about the disappearances, about the neighbors who were there one day and gone the next. If America wasn't the enemy, then who was? The answer was too terrible to face directly, but it lurked at the edges of Greta's thoughts, growing stronger every day. She pulled the blanket over her head and tried to sleep, but the breakfast kept coming back. The smell of cinnamon, the taste of butter, the simple, devastating proof that everything she'd been taught was wrong. His name was Private Douglas Sherman, and he was 19 years old. Greta learned this because he talked while he worked. He was one of the regular guards assigned to the women's compound, and unlike some of the others, he didn't maintain strict silence. "My mom sends care packages," he told Greta one afternoon while she hung laundry. "She includes cookies for the whole unit. Even sent some German cookie recipes. Can you believe that? Like she knew y'all were here." He spoke to her like a person, not a prisoner, not an enemy. A person. "That's kind," Greta managed in English. "She's a good lady." Douglas adjusted his helmet against the Texas sun. "She keeps asking if I've met any interesting people here. I told her about you ladies. She said to treat you right. Said you're probably scared and far from home." He said this casually, as if it were obvious, as if their fear and displacement were visible and worthy of compassion. "Your mother sounds wise," Greta said. "She is. She's a teacher back in Ohio. Says education is about understanding people, not just facts." He paused. "I guess she'd say talking to you is part of my education." Another guard, Sergeant Thomas Miller, took a different approach. He was older, 35, maybe with graying hair and a limp from an old wound. He didn't chat, but he did small kindnesses. When it rained, he made sure the women had coats before work detail. When someone felt ill, he personally walked them to the medical clinic. When Katrin received a letter from home with bad news, he gave her space to cry without comment or judgment. One day, Marlene worked up the courage to ask him a question. "Why are you kind to us?" "We're German, your enemy." Miller considered this for a long moment. "My father came from Germany," he finally said. "Left in 1905, settled in Pennsylvania. He used to tell me about the old country, the forests, the music, the people he loved." He looked at Marlene directly. "You're not my enemy. Your government, maybe. But not you. Goebbels said Americans hated all Germans. That you would punish us for being born German." Miller's expression hardened. "Goebbels said a lot of things. Most of them lies. The female guards and nurses were even more direct. Lieutenant Morrison stopped by the barracks one evening to check on a sick prisoner. After administering medicine, she sat on one of the bunks and spoke to the room. "I know you were taught to hate us," she said. "I know you expected torture and abuse. I want you to understand something. That's not who we are. That's what propaganda told you. But it's not truth." "How do we know," Ingrid challenged, "that this isn't propaganda too?" "American propaganda?" Morrison smiled slightly. "You don't. You'll have to figure that out yourselves. But here's a hint. Propaganda usually requires you to stop thinking. Truth encourages you to think more." Another nurse, Corporal Janet Hayes, was blunter. "You know what I heard about German camps?" she said one day while changing bandages in the clinic. "I heard about labor camps where prisoners got 200 calories a day, where people worked until they died, where guards shot prisoners for sport." She looked at Greta, who was there for a minor burn from the laundry press. "Is that true?" Janet asked. Greta wanted to say no, wanted to defend Germany, but the words wouldn't come, because she had heard things too. Whispers, rumors, stories that were quickly silenced. "I don't know," she finally said. "Well, I do," Janet said, "because we've liberated some of those camps, and it's worse than the rumors. Far worse." She finished wrapping the bandage and looked at Greta with something like pity. "You seem like a good person. I hope you never knew. I hope you never participated. But you should know that when people say they were just following orders, We don't accept that anymore. Not after what we've seen. Greta felt sick. I was a nurse, she whispered. I helped people. I tried to save lives. I believe you, Janet said. And I'm glad you're here, safe. Being fed and treated well. Because that's what civilized people do, even to their enemies. The contrast was devastating. German prisoners being fed and sheltered and treated with basic human dignity, while German camps, if the Americans were telling the truth, had done the opposite. That evening, a small miracle occurred. Douglas showed up at the barracks with a gramophone and a box of records. Commander approved recreation time, he announced. Figured you ladies might like some music. The records were mostly American Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Frank Sinatra. But at the bottom of the box, someone had included a few German recordings. Douglas put on a Marlene Dietrich record, and the sound of German lyrics filled the barracks. Several women started crying. It was the first time they'd heard their language sung in months. The first familiar thing in a sea of strange American customs. Douglas looked alarmed. I'm sorry, should I turn it off? No, Marlene managed through tears. Please, let it play. So he did. He sat in the corner, young and uncomfortable, while a barracks full of enemy prisoners wept to the sound of home. When the record ended, he carefully packed up the gramophone. I'll bring it back next week, he promised. After he left, Anna spoke into the silence. He didn't have to do that. None of them do, Marlene agreed. The food, the medicine, the kindness. They don't have to do any of it. So why do they? Katrine asked. No one had an answer. But the question itself was revolutionary, because it required them to acknowledge that maybe the Americans were genuinely good people, and if that was true, then everything else had to be re-examined. Every belief, every assumption, every word from Goebbels' mouth. Greta lay in bed that night and thought about Douglas Sherman's mother in Ohio, a teacher who baked cookies and reminded her son to be kind. She thought about Sergeant Miller's German father, who had left the old country for the new world. She thought about Lieutenant Morrison and Corporal Hayes, who treated prisoners with dignity, even when they were angry about what those prisoners' nation had done. These were not monsters. They were just people. Complicated, flawed, but fundamentally decent people. And if these were the Americans, the real Americans, then who were the monsters? The answer was becoming harder to avoid. By the second month, the letters started arriving. Not many international mail was still complicated, but enough to shatter whatever illusions remained. Greta's mother wrote first, "My darling girl, I cannot believe you are alive. When you were captured, I thought I would never see you again. Everyone said the Americans would." The sentence was crossed out. "But you are being fed. You are working. You have shelter. Greta, things here are so much worse. There is no food, no fuel. The cities are destroyed. People are dying. If you are truly safe in America, stay there as long as you can." The letter continued with news from home. Deaths, disappearances, starvation. The paradise of Goebbels' propaganda was gone, if it had ever existed. Marlene received a letter from her sister. They are asking questions about Papa, about his work with the party, about what he knew. Marlene, what did he know? What did any of us know? The letter trailed off into desperate confusion. Anna's letter was worse. Her family was in the Soviet occupation zone. Her mother wrote in coded language, but the message was clear. Life under Soviet rule was brutal. People were being rounded up, accused, disappeared. The Russians hate us, Anna said numbly. Goebbels was right about that, at least. Was he? Ingrid challenged. Or did we give them reasons to hate us? The question was becoming unavoidable. The library newspapers that Ingrid had been reading became communal resources. The women would gather in the evening, and Ingrid would translate articles, stories about liberated camps, photographs that made several women run outside to vomit, testimony from survivors, Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, names that would haunt history. "They're lying," one woman insisted. "Allied propaganda, to make us look bad." But the evidence kept mounting. Different newspapers, different sources, eyewitness accounts, photos from multiple angles, and then a German prisoner in the men's compound, a former SS officer, confirmed it during a shouted conversation through the fence. "Of course it's real," he yelled. "We were purifying the race, following orders. The Führer knew best." The women on the other side of the fence stood in horrified silence. He was proud of it, proud of the camps, proud of the murders. That night, Greta couldn't eat dinner. The food tasted like ash. "We didn't know," Marlene kept saying. "We couldn't have known. People knew," Ingrid countered. "Maybe not details, but they knew something was happening. The disappearances, the whispers, the way certain topics were forbidden. I was 16, Anna protested. What was I supposed to do? I don't know. But pretending we saw nothing that helps no one." The arguments went on for weeks. Some women denied everything. Some accepted it with numb horror. Some fell into depression so deep the nurses had to intervene. Greta found herself somewhere in the middle, trying to reconcile the Germany she'd loved, the music, the forests, the culture, with the Germany that had built factories of death. One afternoon, Lieutenant Morrison found her sitting alone under a tree. "You look troubled," Morrison said. "How do you live with it?" Greta asked. "Knowing your country did terrible things?" Morrison sat down beside her. "America has done terrible things too. Slavery. The treatment of native peoples. It's not the same as what Germany did, but it's not nothing. So, how do you live with it? By doing better. By learning. By refusing to repeat those mistakes." Morrison looked at her. "You're not responsible for what your government did, but you are responsible for what you do next. How you choose to remember. What you choose to believe. Whether you'll let propaganda control you again. I don't know what to believe anymore." "Good," Morrison said. "Start there, with not knowing, and build carefully. Test your beliefs. Ask questions. Think for yourself." Goebbels said thinking for yourself was dangerous. Morrison smiled sadly. He was right about that. It is dangerous to people like him. The comparison to Soviet treatment of prisoners became another source of revelation. The women learned, through letters and whispered conversations with other POWs, that German prisoners in Soviet hands were dying by the thousands. Worked to death. Frozen. Starved. The comparison was stark. In American hands, adequate food, medical care, humane treatment. In Soviet hands, death. "Maybe this is just propaganda too," one woman suggested. "Maybe the Soviets are actually," but no one believed it. The letters from home, the testimonies, the evidence, it all pointed the same direction. The Americans and British treated prisoners well. The Soviets did not. And Germany? Germany had treated prisoners worst of all. The moral math was becoming unavoidable. By the third month, something had shifted in the compound. The denial was fading. The truth was settling in. They had fought for the wrong side. They had believed lies. They had supported, even if unknowingly, atrocities beyond comprehension. And the Americans, the supposed monsters, had responded with mercy. The weight of that realization was crushing. Some women stopped eating again, despite the abundance of food. Some cried for days. Some retreated into silence. But some, like Greta, began to process it. Slowly, painfully, she started asking questions, reading newspapers, talking to the guards about American history, about democracy, about freedom of speech. She learned that Americans criticized their own government, that newspapers printed opposing views, that people could protest, disagree, argue, and no one disappeared in the night. The concept was alien and fascinating. "You can say the president is wrong?" she asked Douglas one day. "Sure. People do it all the time. And you won't be arrested? Not unless you're actually breaking laws. But criticism? That's protected. First Amendment." Greta tried to imagine criticizing Hitler in public. The immediate arrest, the consequences. "That's freedom," Douglas said, noticing her expression. "Real freedom, not what Goebbels sold you." The pieces were coming together. Slowly, painfully. America wasn't perfect. The guards and nurses admitted this freely. Segregation, inequality, problems that needed fixing. But it was better than what Germany had become. Better than the lies and the camps and the propaganda. That was the truth that breakfast had revealed. Not that America was paradise, but that it was real, flawed and human and real. While Germany had been a fantasy built on lies and murder, the truth hurt more than any torture could have. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The women heard the news on the radio in the mess hall. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Reich was finished. The reaction in the compound was complicated. Relief that the killing was over. Grief for the destroyed homeland. Fear about what came next. But mostly, numbness. They had spent months coming to terms with what Germany had done. The defeat felt less like tragedy and more like justice. Good, Ingrid said simply when she heard the news. It should end. The POW camp remained open for another year, while the Allies sorted through millions of displaced people, refugees, and prisoners. The women continued their routines. Work, meals, letters from home that painted increasingly grim pictures of occupation and reconstruction. Some women requested to stay in America rather than return to Germany. The process was complicated, but not impossible. Katrin was one of the first. She had distant cousins in Wisconsin and no family left in Germany. "I can't go back," she told Greta. "Everything I knew is gone, and I don't want to live in the ruins of that lie." She was approved for immigration. The last Greta saw of her, she was boarding a bus to Wisconsin, carrying a small suitcase and a letter of recommendation from the camp commander. Marlene chose to return. "My sister is there," she explained. "She needs family." Anna went back too, despite the Soviet occupation of her hometown. "It's still home," she said, though her eyes told a different story. Ingrid stayed. She applied to work as a translator for the American occupation forces in Germany. Approved. "Someone needs to help with reconstruction," she said. "Might as well be someone who learned from mistakes." Greta struggled with the decision for months. Her mother was in Germany, but her mother's letters kept saying, "If you can stay, stay. There's nothing here for you anymore." In the end, she requested immigration and was approved. She settled in Texas, near the camp, found work as a nurse, eventually married an American veteran who'd lost his wife during the war, had children who grew up speaking English first, German second. She never forgot that first breakfast. She would tell the story to her children, her grandchildren, anyone who would listen. "They gave us eggs," she would say, "and butter, and cinnamon rolls. They didn't have to. We were enemies, but they fed us like human beings, and that's how I knew," she would finish, "that I had been lied to my entire life." Joseph Goebbels died in May 1945, taking cyanide in a Berlin bunker as Soviet forces closed in. His ministry of propaganda died with him, but the lies lived on. In memories, in learned behaviors, in the reflexive fear of otherness that he had so carefully cultivated. Undoing those lies would take generations. For the women who'd been prisoners in America, the process started with breakfast, not a speech, not a newsreel, not a counter-propaganda campaign, just scrambled eggs and cinnamon rolls. The simplicity of it was profound. Goebbels had built an empire of lies using every tool available. Radio, newspapers, films, rallies, education, intimidation. Millions of marks spent. Thousands of hours of broadcasts, countless posters and pamphlets and speeches, all defeated by the decision to feed prisoners properly. The irony wasn't lost on the women who lived it. "He spent years telling us you were monsters," Greta once told Lieutenant Morrison. "You proved him wrong with breakfast." Morrison smiled. "We just followed the rules. Geneva Convention. Basic human decency. It wasn't strategy, it was the right thing to do." "That's my point," Greta said. "You didn't need a propaganda ministry to be good. You just were." The lesson extended beyond individual experience. After the war, as Germany began the long process of denazification and reconstruction, stories from POWs became important. what they had seen, what they had learned. The women who'd been in American camps told their stories about the food, the medical care, the guards who called them ma'am, and slowly, painfully, Germany began to understand what it had become, what it had done, what lies it had believed. The breakfast became a symbol, a small moment that contained larger truths. That propaganda requires constant maintenance, but truth only needs to be demonstrated once. That fear is a powerful tool, but experience is stronger. That you can't sustain a lie about people's basic humanity when those people treat you humanely. In 1985, Greta returned to the site of the POW camp. It was gone now, converted to other uses, but she stood where the mess hall had been and remembered. A journalist interviewing her for a documentary about POWs asked, "What was the moment you knew you'd been lied to?" Greta smiled. "The smell of cinnamon. That first morning. That's when I knew." Because of the food? Because of what the food represented. Choice, care, recognition that even enemies deserve basic human dignity. She paused. Goebbels never prepared us for kindness. He didn't have a counter-argument for it. The documentary never aired, but Greta kept telling the story. She told it to anyone who would listen. She told it especially to young people who seemed too certain of their beliefs, too convinced they knew everything, too quick to dehumanize others. "I was 16, she would say, and absolutely certain that Americans were monsters. I was wrong, completely, catastrophically wrong, because I believed what I was told instead of thinking for myself. So how do you know what's true?" they would ask. "You test it, you question it, you stay curious. And when someone tells you that an entire group of people are less than human, you don't believe them. Ever. For any reason." She lived to be 93. At her memorial service, her daughter read from a worn journal Greta had kept during her time in the POW camp. One entry, dated the 15th of May 1945. "Today we heard the war is over. Germany has surrendered. I should feel sad, but I don't. I feel relieved. The lie is over. The nightmare is over. Now comes the harder part, building something true. I don't know if I'm strong enough, but I know this much. I will never again believe someone who tells me to hate. I will never again accept propaganda as truth. I will never again trust a government that demands I stop thinking, and I will never forget the smell of that first breakfast, the eggs and the butter and the cinnamon, the proof that humanity can survive even the worst lies. If I remember nothing else, I will remember that." The daughter closed the journal and looked at the assembled mourners. "My mother always said the Americans didn't defeat Germany with weapons. They defeated the lie, and the weapon they used was kindness." She smiled through tears. And breakfast. The last surviving member of that first transport of German POW women to America died in 2018. Her name was Anna Weber. She was 94. In her final interview, recorded for a Holocaust museum, she was asked what she wanted people to remember. "Remember that good people can believe terrible lies," she said. "I was a good person. I wasn't evil. But I believed evil things because that's what I was taught." "And the breakfast?" the interviewer prompted. Anna smiled, the same smile she'd worn for 70 years when telling this story. "The breakfast saved me. Not my life, they were never going to kill me, but my soul, my ability to think, my humanity." She leaned forward, looking directly at the camera. "When someone tells you that another group of people are monsters, remember my story. Remember that I believed it completely. And remember that I was wrong." "How do we avoid making the same mistakes?" the interviewer asked. Anna thought for a long moment. "Feed your enemies breakfast," she finally said. "Treat them like human beings, not because they deserve it, but because you need to remember that they are human. The moment you forget that, the moment you accept that some people are less than human, you've already lost." She died 3 weeks later. Her obituary noted that she had been a POW in America during World War II. It mentioned the breakfast, and it included a quote that had become her motto: "They didn't defeat us with weapons. They defeated the lie." That quote has since appeared in textbooks, on memorial plaques, and in countless essays about propaganda, warfare, and human rights. Because it captures something essential. That truth doesn't require a ministry. That kindness is more powerful than rhetoric. That sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply treating people decently. All because 60 German women walked into a Texas mess hall in 1945 and smelled cinnamon. All because someone decided that even enemies deserved scrambled eggs. All because America chose to prove Goebbels wrong with the simplest possible method. They served breakfast.